April 16th, 1945. The waters off Okinawa stretched out under a sky that should have been peaceful. The morning light hit the surface of the East China Sea in long, golden lines, and for a brief moment the world looked still. But aboard the USS Laffey, a destroyer stationed at one of the most dangerous positions in the entire Pacific Theater, every single crew member knew that stillness was a lie. They had been assigned to Radar Picket Station Number 1, the outermost ring of defense for the massive Allied fleet anchored near Okinawa. It was the position closest to Japan, the position most exposed, the position where Japanese aircraft would arrive first. And on that morning, the crew of the Laffey had no idea they were about to face one of the most relentless aerial assaults ever recorded against a single warship. 6 kamikaze planes would slam directly into their ship. 4 bombs would find their mark, and somehow, against every law of physics and probability, the Laffey would still be floating when it was over. This is the story of the ship that absolutely, stubbornly, defiantly refused to sink. To understand what happened that day, you first need to understand what the Laffey was and what she had already survived. The USS Laffey, hull number DD-724, was an Allen M. Sumner-class destroyer, one of the most capable warships of her size in the United States Navy during World War II. She displaced roughly 2,200 tons, stretched 376 feet from bow to stern, and carried an impressive arsenal for a ship of her class. Her main armament consisted of 6 5-inch guns arranged in 3 twin turrets, complemented by a battery of 40mm Bofors anti-aircraft guns and 20mm Oerlikon cannons positioned at various points along her deck. She was fast, capable of exceeding 34 knots driven by 60,000 shaft horsepower generated by her steam turbine engines. Her hull was constructed with high-tensile steel, designed to withstand the punishing seas of the open ocean and the concussive forces of nearby explosions. She carried torpedo launchers, depth charge racks, and a sophisticated fire control system that allowed her gun crews to track and engage fast-moving aerial targets with remarkable precision. In every respect, she was a state-of-the-art fighting machine, a product of the massive industrial mobilization that had transformed American shipyards into round-the-clock production lines, turning out warships at a rate the world had never seen before. But what truly made the Laffey remarkable was not her specifications. It was the crew that served aboard her, roughly 300 officers and enlisted men who had trained together, lived together in the cramped quarters below decks, and formed the kind of bond that only shared danger can create. The ship had been commissioned in February of 1944, and within months she was already in combat. Her first major engagement came during the D-Day landings at Normandy in June of that year, where she provided critical naval gunfire support to troops storming the beaches. According to after-action reports, the Laffey engaged enemy shore batteries and survived direct fire exchanges with German coastal defenses. She had proven herself in the Atlantic, and then she was sent to the Pacific, where the war had taken on a completely different and far more terrifying character. By the spring of 1945, the Japanese military had adopted a strategy of desperation that would define the final months of the conflict: the systematic use of kamikaze attacks. Young Japanese pilots, many of them barely out of training, were being loaded into aircraft packed with explosives and ordered to fly directly into Allied ships. There was no plan for survival. There was no evasion maneuver. The pilot was the guidance system, and the aircraft was the weapon. Unlike a conventional bombing run, where the attacking pilot would release his ordnance and then attempt to escape, a kamikaze attack ended only one way. The plane kept coming. Even when hit by anti-aircraft fire, even when trailing smoke, even when pieces of the aircraft were being torn away by defensive rounds, the plane kept coming. As long as the pilot was alive and the aircraft had forward momentum, it remained a threat. It was warfare at its most psychologically devastating, and for the sailors on the receiving end, young men who had to stand at their gun mounts and watch a human being deliberately fly a plane loaded with explosives directly at them, it was an experience that no amount of training could fully prepare them for. The radar picket stations around Okinawa were specifically designed to provide early warning of incoming air attacks against the main fleet. Destroyers and smaller escort vessels were positioned in a wide arc to the north and west, closer to Japan, acting as the first line of detection. The crews on these picket stations knew exactly what their role meant. They were bait. They were the ships that would detect the incoming kamikazes first, report their approach, and then try to survive whatever came their way. Radar Picket Station. Number 1 was the most forward of all these positions, placed roughly 50 miles from the main fleet anchorage. It was by every measure the most dangerous assignment available, and the Laffey drew that assignment on April 16th. If you are finding this story gripping, take a moment to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. Every like helps more people discover stories like this one, and subscribing means you will never miss another deep dive into the most incredible moments in military history. Now, let us return to what happened next. Because what the crew of the Laffey endured over the following 80 minutes would become one of the most extraordinary survival stories of the entire Second World War. The morning had started with an uneasy quiet that pressed down on the ship like a physical weight. The crew had been at general quarters since before dawn, a standard precaution at the picket stations. Every man was at his battle station. The gun crews sat beside their weapons, helmets strapped tight, life jackets secured. Below decks, the engineering teams monitored gauges and valve readings, keeping the boilers hot and the turbines ready for immediate high-speed maneuvering. In the Combat Information Center, the officers studied charts and plotted coordinates, while the radio operators listened to chatter from neighboring picket stations and the main fleet. The radar operators scanned their screens with the focused intensity of men who knew that the blips appearing on those screen displays could mean life or death. The sea around them was empty. The sky above was clear, but reports from other picket stations had already confirmed increased Japanese air activity in the region. Something was building. Everyone could feel it. Then the radar screens lit up. Multiple contacts appeared, approaching from the north, flying low and fast. The initial count was difficult to determine because the incoming aircraft were using terrain masking techniques, flying close to the water to delay detection. But within minutes, the scope of the attack became horrifyingly clear. This was not a small raid. This was a massive coordinated assault involving more than 20 Japanese aircraft, and a significant number of them were heading directly for the Laffey. The first wave struck with shocking speed. According to documented accounts, the initial attackers came in from multiple directions simultaneously, a tactic designed to overwhelm the ship's defensive fire. The Laffey's gun crews responded with everything they had. The 5-inch guns barked and roared, sending rounds screaming into the sky at approaching aircraft. The 40mm Bofors hammered away in rapid succession, filling the air with explosive shells. The 20mm Oerlikon cannons added their distinctive chattering fire to the wall of steel the crew was trying to build between themselves and the incoming planes. Several Japanese aircraft were hit and destroyed during their approach, trailing smoke and fire as they cartwheeled into the sea. But there were too many. They were coming too fast, and some of them got through. The first kamikaze struck the Laffey on the after section of the ship, crashing into the superstructure near the stern. The impact was devastating. A massive fireball erupted as the aircraft's fuel and explosives detonated on contact. Steel twisted and buckled. Shrapnel scythed through the air in every direction. Crew members who had been manning nearby gun positions were thrown from their feet by the concussion. Fires broke out immediately, fed by aviation fuel that spread across the deck like liquid fire. The damage control teams already standing by rushed toward the impact zone, dragging hoses and firefighting equipment through smoke so thick it was nearly impossible to breathe. But there was no time to recover. Within moments, a second aircraft was already on its final approach. The gun crews, some of them bleeding from wounds sustained in the first impact, swung their weapons toward the new threat and opened fire. Rounds tore into the approaching plane, shredding its wings and fuselage. But its momentum carried it forward. It slammed into the ship's port side, detonating with a force that sent a shockwave through the entire hull. The Laffey shuddered like a living thing struck by a blow it could barely withstand. More fires erupted. More crew members fell. The ship began to list slightly as water poured through ruptured hull plates below the waterline. What followed was a relentless, almost incomprehensible sequence of attacks that stretched over more than an hour. The Japanese pilots came in waves, sometimes with only seconds between individual strikes. The Laffey's crew fought with a ferocity and determination that went beyond anything that could be explained by training alone. According to survivors' accounts documented after the battle, many crew members continued firing their weapons even after sustaining serious injuries. Gun crews whose mounts had been destroyed by previous hits grabbed whatever weapons they could find on rifles, pistols, even empty shell casings hurled in desperation. Anything to resist the onslaught. A third kamikaze hit the ship amidships, its impact tearing through the deck plating and igniting ammunition stored in nearby ready service lockers. The explosions that followed sent columns of flame and debris high into the air. A fourth aircraft, despite being riddled with anti-aircraft fire, managed to crash into the ship's stern, destroying one of the aft gun mounts completely and killing every crew member manning it. The blast was so powerful that it warped the ship's rudder mechanism, leaving the Laffey unable to steer. She began turning in slow, uncontrolled circles, presenting an even easier target for the remaining attackers, and still the attacks continued. A fifth kamikaze dove toward the ship from a steep angle, its engine screaming at full throttle. The crew members who saw it coming described a moment of almost surreal clarity. The dark silhouette of the aircraft growing larger with terrifying speed against the bright morning sky. It struck near the ship's fantail, adding to the catastrophic damage already concentrated at the stern. By this point, the aft section of the Laffey was a mangled wreck of twisted steel, burning fuel, and shattered equipment. Multiple compartments were flooded. Several gun mounts were completely destroyed. The ship was burning from multiple points, and the smoke was so dense that crew members in different sections of the vessel could no longer see each other. Then the sixth kamikaze hit. It came in low and fast, skimming the water's surface before pulling up at the last moment and slamming into the ship. The impact point was once again near the stern, compounding the already catastrophic structural damage. The explosion tore open additional hull sections and knocked out the ship's remaining aft weaponry. The Laffey was now fighting for her life with only her forward gun mounts still operational. Fires raged across her entire length. Her rudder was jammed. Her speed was dropping as damage to her engineering spaces began to affect propulsion. She had lost 32 crew members killed, with 71 more wounded, many of them severely. By any reasonable assessment, the ship should have been sinking, but she was not sinking. And the reason she was not sinking was the crew. The damage control teams aboard the Laffey performed what can only be described as superhuman work under impossible conditions. As each successive hit tore new holes in the ship, these teams rushed to contain the flooding, extinguish the fires, and shore up weakened bulkheads. They worked in near-total darkness in many compartments, feeling their way through smoke-filled passageways, wading through water that was rising around their legs, patching holes with whatever materials they could find, mattresses, wooden planks, pieces of clothing. Anything that could slow the flow of seawater into the ship's interior was pressed into service. They counter-flooded compartments on the opposite side of the ship to correct the dangerous list that threatened to capsize the vessel. They isolated damaged sections by sealing watertight doors, even when they knew that doing so might trap wounded crew members on the other side. On deck, the scene was equally desperate and equally heroic. Gun crews that had lost their mounts moved to assist crews that were still firing. Ammunition handlers formed human chains to pass shells from magazines deep in the ship to the remaining operational gun positions. Medical personnel moved among the wounded, providing first aid under fire, triaging injuries with the grim efficiency of professionals who understood that every second spent on one casualty was a second not spent on another. According to reports compiled after the battle, several crew members who had been ordered to abandon their stations due to injuries refused to leave and continued performing their duties until they physically collapsed. In addition to the 6 kamikaze impacts, the Laffey was also struck by 4 conventional bombs dropped by Japanese aircraft during the same engagement. These bombs caused additional fires, structural damage, and casualties, further compounding the already overwhelming toll the ship had absorbed. Analysis conducted after the battle revealed that the Laffey had been attacked by a total of approximately 22 Japanese aircraft during the engagement. The ship's gunners, despite the chaos and destruction around them, managed to shoot down 9 of the attacking aircraft and assisted in the destruction of several others. It was a staggering defensive performance by a crew that was fighting not just for victory, but for survival. The attacks finally subsided not because the Japanese ran out of determination, but because combat air patrol fighters from the fleet carriers offshore arrived in force to intercept the remaining attackers. According to documented reports, the sight of American fighters engaging the Japanese aircraft overhead brought a surge of relief to the battered crew of the Laffey. But relief was tempered by the reality of what surrounded them. Their ship was a wreck. The stern was barely recognizable as part of a warship. Fires still burned in multiple locations. The rudder was destroyed. Several compartments were completely flooded. The dead lay alongside the wounded on decks slick with fuel, blood, and seawater. The ship was still turning in slow circles. Unable to steer, her surviving crew clinging to the hope that the hull would hold together long enough for help to arrive. And help did arrive. A fleet tug reached the Laffey and took her under tow, beginning the slow, agonizing process of pulling the crippled destroyer away from the combat zone and toward the relative safety of the anchorage at Kuramaredo. The tow was itself a precarious operation. The Laffey was so badly damaged that there were genuine concerns she might break apart during the journey. Crew members remained at their damage control stations throughout the tow, continuously monitoring the integrity of the hull and fighting to keep the flooding under control. Every wave that struck the ship sent new surges of water through the damaged sections. Every shift in the wind threatened to reignite fires that had been barely extinguished. The distance to safety was not great in nautical terms, but for the crew of the Laffey, it felt like the longest voyage of their lives. She made it. The Laffey reached Kuramaredo and was stabilized by repair crews who marveled at the extent of the damage she had absorbed. Engineers who inspected the ship afterward reported that it was difficult to comprehend how the vessel had remained afloat. The number of penetrations in her hull, the extent of the structural deformation, the sheer volume of water she had taken on, all of it pointed to a ship that should have gone to the bottom. But the Laffey had not gone to the bottom. She had survived through a combination of superb naval architecture, the relentless efforts of her damage control teams, and the raw, unbreakable determination of her crew. When the guns finally fell silent and the last of the attacking aircraft had either been destroyed or driven off, the crew of the Laffey found themselves standing in what felt like a different world than the one they had woken up in that morning. The ship around them was almost unrecognizable. The clean lines of the destroyer had been replaced by a jagged landscape of torn metal, collapsed deck structures, and blackened blast zones. The smell was overwhelming. A mixture of burning fuel, scorched metal, cordite from expended ammunition, and the unmistakable copper scent of blood. Crew members who had been fighting in isolated sections of the ship emerged from smoke-filled compartments and saw for the first time the full extent of what they had survived. Many of them simply stood in silence, unable to process the devastation that surrounded them. The aftermath of the battle brought recognition. The ship received the Presidential Unit Citation, one of the highest honors that could be bestowed upon a military unit. Individual crew members received numerous decorations for their actions during the engagement, including Silver Stars, Bronze Stars, and Purple Hearts. The commanding officer's leadership during the attack was specifically cited as a critical factor in the ship's survival. His decision-making under pressure, his ability to coordinate defensive fire and damage control simultaneously, and his refusal to consider abandoning the vessel were all noted in official reports as exemplary. But beyond the medals and the citations, what the Battle of April 16, 1945, truly represented was a testament to something deeper. It was a demonstration of what human beings are capable of when they refuse to give up. The crew of the Laffey faced an onslaught that would have overwhelmed most ships and most crews. They took blow after blow after blow, each one seemingly worse than the last, each one threatening to be the one that finally broke them. And they kept fighting. They kept repairing. They kept firing. They kept their ship alive through sheer force of will. In the decades that followed the war, the USS Laffey earned a nickname that perfectly captured what she represented. She became known as the ship that would not die. It was a title that honored not just the vessel itself, but every single person who had served aboard her during those terrible 80 minutes off Okinawa. The steel and the rivets and the welding held the hull together, but it was the courage and the sacrifice and the absolute refusal to surrender that kept the Laffey from becoming another wreck on the ocean floor. The ship was eventually repaired at a shipyard on the West Coast, a process that took months and required the replacement of entire sections of her hull and superstructure. The extent of the repairs was so significant that some questioned whether it would have been more economical to simply build a new ship. But the decision was made to save the Laffey, and the shipyard workers who rebuilt her did so with the knowledge that they were restoring something more than a warship. They were preserving a symbol. Once repaired, she returned to active service. She continued to serve in the United States Navy through the Korean War era, participating in additional operations and earning further service decorations before finally being decommissioned. But her story did not end with decommissioning. The Laffey was preserved as a museum ship, and she sits today at Patriots Point Naval and Maritime Museum in Mount Pleasant, South Carolina. Visitors can walk her decks, stand in the same positions where gun crews fought off wave after wave of kamikaze attacks, and look out over the same type of sea that nearly claimed her. The scars of battle have been preserved, visible reminders of what the ship endured. For those who visit, the experience is often deeply moving. Standing on the deck of the Laffey, looking at the repaired sections where kamikazes struck, reading the names of the 32 crew members who gave their lives that day, it transforms the story from something abstract and historical into something viscerally real. These were real people, young men, most of them in their late teens and early 20s, who found themselves in one of the most terrifying combat situations imaginable and responded with extraordinary bravery. They did not know they would survive. They did not know the ship would hold together. They only knew that their shipmates were depending on them, and they refused to let them down. The Battle of Okinawa in its broader context was one of the bloodiest engagements of the Pacific War. The kamikaze campaign launched by Japan during the battle resulted in the sinking of dozens of Allied ships and damage to hundreds more. Thousands of sailors were killed or wounded. The psychological toll on the crews who survived was immense and lasting. Many veterans of the picket station duty reported nightmares and anxiety for years after the war. The memory of watching aircraft deliberately fly into ships was something that stayed with them for the rest of their lives. The Laffey's experience, while extreme, was part of this larger pattern of sacrifice and endurance that characterized the final months of the conflict. What makes the Laffey's story stand apart, even among the many acts of heroism during the Battle of Okinawa, is the sheer concentration of punishment the ship absorbed in such a short period of time. 6 kamikaze impacts and 4 bomb hits in approximately 80 minutes. An average of roughly 1 major hit every 8 minutes. Each impact would have been a significant event on its own. Together, they represented an accumulation of destruction that defied what naval architects believed a destroyer could survive. The Allen M. Sumner-class was well designed and well built, but no designer had ever anticipated that one of these ships would need to absorb this level of punishment and remain afloat. The Laffey survived because her crew improvised, adapted, and simply refused to accept that their ship was lost. There is a lesson in the story of the Laffey that extends beyond military history. It is a lesson about resilience, about what happens when circumstances become so overwhelming that giving up seems like the only rational option, and choosing to fight on anyway. The crew members aboard the Laffey on April 16, 1945, were not superhuman. They were ordinary young men placed in an extraordinary situation. They were scared, they were exhausted, they were wounded. They watched their friends die, and they kept going. Not because they were incapable of fear, but because they understood that the alternative, giving up, letting the ship sink, abandoning the fight, was simply not something they were willing to accept. That refusal, that stubborn, defiant, absolute refusal to accept defeat, is what turned a damaged destroyer into a legend. The Laffey did not survive because of luck. She survived because her crew made the conscious decision, again and again, with every new explosion and every new fire and every new flood of seawater, that their ship was not going to sink. Not today. Not on their watch. And so when we say that 6 kamikazes hit the USS Laffey and she still refused to sink, we are not really talking about the ship. Ships do not refuse anything. We are talking about the people inside her. We are talking about the gunners who fired until their weapons melted. The damage control teams who patched holes while standing in rising water. The medical personnel who treated wounds under conditions that no hospital could replicate. The officers who made impossible decisions with impossible calm. The young sailors who had never imagined they would face anything like this and discovered, in the worst moment of their lives that they were capable of more than they ever thought possible. The USS Laffey sits quietly in her berth at Patriots Point today. The harbor around her is calm. Seabirds circle overhead. Tourists walk her passageways and read the plaques that tell her story. But if you stand on her deck long enough, if you let the silence settle around you, you can almost feel it. That stubborn, unyielding spirit that kept her alive when everything said she should have died. It lives in the steel, it echoes in the compartments, it whispers from the gun mounts that once blazed with defiant fire against an overwhelming sky. She is the ship that would not die, and her story deserves to be remembered for as long as courage itself has meaning.